Hey, Bengals fans, how are you? It's Anthony Cosenza with Cincy Jungle and the Orange and Black Insider, episode number 4. If you can believe it, we are a month old this show
Wow.
already, and it's been a really fun project. We've got a lot of fun feedback from listeners and readers on our site, as well as our multimedia accounts, our social media accounts, I should say. You can follow us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can download us now. I mentioned this, I believe, last week. You can download us now on iTunes. So check out the Orange and Black Insider on iTunes. It's under the podcast. We are official, and like I said last week, I'm waiting for my blue check on
Blue
Twitter.
check mark.
That's right. That's right. I am joined by Connor Howe and Scott Schultze. Scott, how are you?
Great. You?
I'm doing well. Good to have you here. Connor, you've been doing a little bit of double duty, some Charger stuff and Bengals stuff. How you hanging in there?
Ready for real football.
That's right. That's right. And given how some of the camp has gone for the Bengals so far in terms of unfortunate injuries and news on that front, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I think everybody's ready for real football, and they're ready to get guys back on the field who have been injured. So let's talk. The Bengals took the field for their first official game. I mean, it was an exhibition. It's preseason, obviously, but you saw your first in-game action with the Bengals in 2016, and it was kind of an odd game against the Minnesota Vikings. They lost by 1 point, 17-16. But if you actually watched the game pretty intently or read about how the game went, especially in the early parts of the game, would have saw a lot of positive things. Connor, I'm going to start with you. Give me first your overall impressions of how the team looked in their preseason opener against the Vikings.
For me, the only thing that really seems to matter to me, I would say, is just the first team. Obviously, it'd be nice to have, um, backups and special teamers who are going to make standout plays. But ultimately, what you really want to see, or at least from my perspective, is who's going to make those plays on offense and defense when the real team's actually on the field. And looking at some offensive line play, some defensive line play from just the first teamers, I think it's encouraging. Russell Bodine he's kind of himself, a little inconsistent, but what I did see was that anytime he had a good play, Jeremy Hill happened to have a great play, or Giovanni Bernard, or whoever happened to be carrying the football. And so
That's a
I
great
think
point.
it's easy for fans to say, "Oh, Bodine's this bad player." He's not bad, and he's just inconsistent. And it's gonna take consistency, and obviously that's gonna be hard. It's easier said than done. But going up against an elite, I would say, defensive tackle in Linval Joseph, I really don't think Bodine could have done much better. He had a couple of plays where it kind of made you a little nervous, but overall he did pretty well. And of course you have AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, Andy Dalton. Everyone seems to be on track. Jeremy Hill looked a lot more decisive in the run game. Overall, it's pretty good. And then obviously the icing on the cake was the fact that Alex Erickson, or basically any receiver behind AJ Green, made plays, which is nice. That's what we need. To see Will Clark. Will Clark had a couple of really good plays, and that was pretty cool. And obviously Michael Johnson also had a couple of more plays. And obviously it'd be nice to see all the defensive end depth, making plays. But I think that with Johnson, Dunlap, and Will Clark, who seems to be, I think, the shoe-in behind Dunlap and Johnson as the third defensive end, and probably the defensive tackle and nickel packages like Wallace Gilberry was before he left. I think that was pretty cool.
So, Scott, you heard some names now from Connor that have impressed, and he gave his overall impressions of the team in their preseason opener. So, give us some of the guys that you saw that jumped off the page. As Connor mentioned, Alex Erickson was a guy that really popped out, and everybody's kind of talking about him. But give us your overall impressions of the team, and maybe a couple of guys who impressed.
Well, the very first one I want to say is the one who I have the jersey for, which is Geno Atkins,
Yep.
Bengals defensive tackle. Not to be confused with any other guys named Geno in the
Yeah,
NFL.
there's another one that yeah.
But just that whole first unit, the defensive line, that first series where they got the pressure, and even that series when they should have had the sack and that back for the Vikings got away. But just seeing that front line, seeing how they were getting the push that we saw last year, and so it's nice to see they still have that, even though Gilberry is not in there. They still have Dunlap, they still have Adkins. They're still able to get that push. It's just very nice to see what are the starters going to do? Because these are the ones, when we play the Jets here in a month, that's the unit that really needs to be doing well, not the second string or third string. And to that effect, same the offensive line. At least at the beginning of the game, they seemed to get some push. They seemed to give Dalton a little time. They were able to move down the field. So seeing how the lines did, the whole idea of battle in the trenches, I thought they did a solid job, especially that defensive line and what the 3 plays I think they were given. And of course, it's hard to say anything off 3 plays, but 3 plays was very nice to see them do it. And of course, Erickson, that punt return was ridiculous. He went from pretty much relative unknown to everyone's new favorite guy of the year. I think a couple years ago it was Trey Hopkins. Last year, Comerell. There's always that guy that everyone wants to root for, that undrafted guy. And I think Erickson, at least after one game, cemented himself as he is now the guy that everyone's kind of rooting for.
Trey Hopkins, people forget that he was the guy who was recruited over such a good way for Texas, and things have changed now.
Yeah. And I even go back a little further, Scott, in terms of Erickson and being kind of a preseason fan favorite. I mean, I look back, if you remember back in the 2009 Hard Knocks documentary when the team was on there, if you remember 2 guys that ended up kind of making, I think it was Tom Nelson and Quan Cosby and guys like that really made a name for themselves as special teamers and doing some other things on their respective units that got them on the final roster. And the wide receiver group is really crowded right now. There's some guys that are dinged up. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but that's a position to really watch throughout the rest of the preseason. I'm in agreement with you guys in terms of overall. I thought the team played a lot better than I originally thought. Unfortunately, I couldn't see a live taping of the show of the game itself, but I was watching stat lines and things of that nature. Initially, when you looked at it, it was like, oh man, this is brutal. They're not doing anything. Well, if you watch that first quarter, I think, which is mostly the 1s and 2s for the Bengals. I mean, I think the 1s basically stayed in a series on offense, maybe a little more on defense. But if you watch that first quarter, the time of possession was outrageously in favor of the Bengals, and I think that's a good indicator as to how they were playing on both sides of the ball. As for a guy that impressed me, I mean, there's a couple. It was nice to see Simon Eyes make a nice long catch. It was nice to see Tyler Boyd make a long catch instead of those dink and dunk stuff, because the one knock on him is he going to have the ability to catch that and the speed to catch that long ball. So he did that. But I really was impressed with A.J. McCarron. I thought he was incredibly accurate once I watched the tape. He was very confident, and a lot of people like to knock him because when he came in last year as the starter, he had all this talent around him, and he could really lean on that. And while that's true, I think you saw him play with a lot of 2s, even some 3s in there, and he really played well and still showed a lot of accuracy, a lot of poise, and I thought he played very well. So that was one guy who really impressed me. Not necessarily totally surprising that he impressed me, but for his first game action of the year, I thought, and playing with other backups, I thought he played pretty well. And I'm going to ask you the same question here, but as for a guy that I was very disappointed with, I think I'm going to go with Margus Hunt, and it's easy. He's one of those guys that's easy to pick on because he's kind of like a Russell Bodine, one of those guys that you have high hopes for and you want him to do well, but for some reason, he just isn't getting it. He tweaked his workout regimen this offseason, and he looked lost at times. There was a play that's pretty well documented. He was pushed totally out of the play and lost contain on a run play that should have been a safety for the Bengals, and he only had 1 tackle and I think about 2 quarters of play. So just not a very good night from him, and I really hope that he begins to step up, because the team didn't really bring in backup competition at the defensive end spot, either in the draft or in free agency. So it's kind of his spot to lose at this point. So Connor, I'm gonna shoot it over to you. Who is a player or a couple of players that disappointed you in their performance on Friday night against the Vikings?
As you mentioned, I think the whole Marcus Hunt thing is pretty disappointing. But for what it's worth, and I don't know if this means anything, but last preseason he tore it up with 3 sacks and didn't really do anything afterwards. So who knows? Maybe this is just a game that
No,
will be
you're
his
right.
wake up
You're right.
call, and maybe he goes. I think it's too early for fans to just say, oh, cut Hunt, because we're in all reality, what do we have behind Dunlap and Johnson? Hopefully, Will Clark will show up. Hopefully, Marcus Harrison's versatile enough to play outside. Hopefully, a guy like Ryan Brown or the raccoon guy, whatever his name is, will show up. But in all reality, we really don't have much, and so I think it's way too preemptive to just say, Marcus Hunt's out. Anyways, besides that, I think another guy who on the same play as Marcus Hunt, which somehow didn't really go that noticed, was PJ Dawson. Completely blew he took a really terrible angle to the ball on the play that should have been a safety. And obviously, there's multiple reasons why the ball carrier got out of the end zone in the first place. But I think that Hunt and Dawson on that one particular play really it was frustrating to watch. And aside from that, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I didn't watch all 4 quarters of the game, but winning through a pick, but it's like a tip ball that ended up in someone else's hands. We saw Jimmy Wilson, I think that's his name, got a pick off another tip. I don't really put much weight into those type of plays. Winning, I think, is still the favorite for the third string quarterback, who's probably going to be on the practice squad. I believe he's still eligible. But I think that, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be a disappointment, but I think guys who really need big games or who should need big games this week are just going to be guys like Jake Kumaro, Mario Alford, those guys who really want to compete for the wide receiver 3 position. Just by virtue of Erickson having a huge game, he's already taken a step ahead of guys like, Kumaro, Alford, maybe James Wright. And James Wright, come on, man, he's got to do something. He has the reputation of being a solid special teamer. But the whole, he had 5 catches 2 years ago. I mean, that whole thing needs to. I don't understand how fans can say,
Yeah,
well,
I
Cody
agree.
Core's 3 catches in one preseason game doesn't mean anything, which I don't think it means a ton, but it has to mean something, versus the fact that Wright has 5 catches in his entire career on 16 targets. People forget that. So, I mean, those guys behind AJ Green and Tyler Boyd, and obviously we'll talk about the whole receiver situation in a little bit, I think, but those guys really need to step it up. And just by virtue of them not having the game that Erickson had, when Erickson's a guy where most of us probably weren't expecting him to be the guy, maybe a guy like Simonides or Kumaro or Alford would have been the guy that we hoped would step up. And obviously I still hope Simonides, as I'm pretty sure you probably hope that Simonides, Kumaro, I feel the same way, and Alford and Wright. Hopefully the guys who have been on the team before and have that experience will be able to step up, or a guy like Simonides who's just a freak athlete. I mean, that's pretty much all I got, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of names, both in the positive and negative, and I agree with you on a lot. And that's one guy that I should have mentioned and didn't, in terms of who impressed me, is Marcus Hardison. If you watched the tape there, I thought he played very well. One guy we haven't talked about in terms of impressing is Nick Vigil. I thought he played pretty well in his debut. So a lot of good things to come out of the game there, but there were some disappointments, as you mentioned there, Connor. Scott, who are some players that may have disappointed you in their showing on Friday night against the Vikings?
Well, I think the easy one that I think we've all beat on is Hunt. Outside of that, I'd say Nugent, just because the team keeps hanging on to him. We keep expecting. I think a lot of fans keep wanting him to eventually turn it up to the level he was when he first entered the league. When he was at Ohio State, he came out with a lot of hype. I think the Jets used like a 3rd-round pick on him. The
I think it
Bengals
was
were
a
really
first or
hoping
second
him.
rounder.
Was
Might have
he?
been a first. It could have been.
I
I
think
think
it
it
was
was
up
either
there.
first or second.
And and maybe I say he was great. I mean, he was an AP Player of the Year, phenomenal, and he was decent, but he's just never been that guy we want him to be. We had that tie against Carolina a couple years ago, which I think cost us a playoff seeding because and very first kick he makes yesterday, same thing, and they never bring in competition. So that would be my biggest disappointment because he's a starter and that's someone you're expecting to make that kick. It's not one of these guys they bring in as a camp body. It's someone you expect to get something from, and we just don't seem to be getting anything from him. But yet, just like with Bodine or these other guys, they don't seem to want to move on. They just seem to be content. This is our guy, and he's average, and by God, that's who we're going to live and die with.
Yep. Yep. So good stuff. Those are the players who impressed us, disappointed us in our overall impressions of the team in their preseason debut. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can email us at theobinsider@gmail.com and give your impressions of the club. This podcast will also be on cincyjungle.com. There'll be a comment thread there. You can leave your comments. We encourage that. Or you can get in touch with us on the Cincy Jungle Facebook page. We monitor that, and you can leave your impressions, comments, all that good stuff there. Now, the opener is in the rear view, so we're now on to week 2. But before we give our goals and who needs to step up in that game, just a little news and notes. Unfortunately, in camp, most of the news is surrounding injuries with the Bengals, and some of them are severe, some of them are not as severe, but they are piling up. The Bengals largely avoided the injury bug last year, and that was part of their big success. But guys that they were probably relying on in backup or rotational roles, or are fighting for a roster spot, are starting to get hurt, and it's really piling up right now. So you have Andrew Billings. We talked about that last week, but we did find out it's a meniscus tear. The season is in jeopardy for him to not play this year. It sounds like he's not going to lose the offseason for next year. That would come with other severe ligament tears in the knee, but that's not good stuff. And then the wide receivers have particularly been hit pretty hard. Connor, I'll start with you on Cody Core. He has a dislocated finger, but he seems like he'll be okay. You've got Brandon LaFell, who's got a ligament injury in his hand. There's not really a lot of clarity going on there. Mario Alford was in a walking boot earlier in the week. What do you make of these injuries? And though some players stepped up and made some nice plays in the preseason debut, we talked about Simon Eyes and other guys. Guys like Kumarau and Wright who didn't really step up. What do you make of the situation with the injuries and everything going on at the wide receiver spot?
Yeah, and really quick before I get into that, fact checked myself. Nugent, 47th overall pick in the second round. Pretty crazy that he was a second round pick. Yep. And so yeah, bring it before I even get into the receivers. Come on, they've got to bring in some competition at the kicker position. I know they brought in, I think his name was John Brown. I wrote a story on him earlier in the summer or in late of the spring. And check that out if you're interested. He has a pretty interesting story, but he's injured right now, which is why didn't really bring in, I don't think, any more competition. But anyways, getting into the receiver talk, as you mentioned, AC, we have a ton of guys who are hurt. It's really unfortunate, honestly. And I think the one injury that is probably the most significant of the receiving corps is obviously Brandon LaFell. He was penciled in as the number 2 wide receiver when he signed the contract with Cincinnati. He's the most experienced receiver in the entire receiving corps. But that's not why he was the number 2. It's more so because he has NFL experience and he has the tape, whereas his competition really doesn't have the tape. And until they can prove themselves and outperform LaFell's going to have that opportunity. So anyways, just with the whole LaFell, we heard, I believe it was something around the lines of, we're going to hear, and this is from, I believe, Jason Cole of Bleacher Report, who, for what it's worth, I'm really not a fan of, and I don't think that he's the best source to trust. But he kind of said that he believes that LaFell is going to have, I think that he's going to think about it for a week, and then he said he's going to make up his decision in about a week or so. And I think that people are very quick to assume that LaFell is going to get that surgery and potentially miss the rest of the season. But just think, I implore fans, think about it from just the perspective of a player really quick, because you're Brandon LaFell, you just signed a 1-year deal, a team-friendly deal with, I think, $1 million guaranteed after making not a ton of money, but a sizable salary in other places. He came to Cincinnati because he wants to play on a contender, and to have that news where you're having an injury that could potentially take you out of the season, coming off a career worst year probably, it's something that I don't think that that fans are understanding that if you're a player in that situation, the last thing on your mind is surgery. The number one thing is, how do I get better? Can I play? Will I play this year? Because he wants the payday, and he obviously wants to help his team succeed. So I think the big thing is, I'm not trying to say LaFell's not going to have surgery, but I think that people are too quick to just assume, oh well, LaFell's going to get surgery because everyone else on the team's getting surgery, everyone at this point's getting surgery, whatever it is. And if that's the case, then Cincinnati has some. It's going to be interesting, to say the least. You have, I would guess, Cody Core is probably going to be the next guy on the pecking order, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's James Wright, maybe it's Alford, maybe it's Kumra, maybe it's Simonize, maybe it's Erickson. We really don't know. But or maybe it's Brandon Tate. I think Brandon Tate, someone who I think we totally forgot to mention in the winners and losers. He played pretty well. And right now he's the. I mean, if LaFell's out, I think Tate right now has the upper hand for the receiver position opposite AJ Green. And what I'll say is that with Core needs to step up. With Alford needs to beat out Tate in the kick returning position. I don't necessarily think there's a scenario. I think that, contrary to popular belief, I think there's a circumstance where Tate and Alford can both make the 53-man roster. I think that Alford just needs to prove himself as a receiver. And then I think Kumro and Simonize, one of the two, really needs to step up. Hopefully, my boy Simonize, I hope it's him. But either way, I just think that I think fans are also just kind of freaking out over something that isn't an issue. At the end of the day, AJ Green has never really had a top-tier wide receiver 2 opposite him on the field in his entire career, besides last year when Marvin Jones really held his own for the whole year. In 2013, you could argue Jones played well, but in retrospect, yeah, he had 10 touchdowns, but 4 of those came in one game against the Jets, and that was a great game. He was a solid player, but he wasn't really that consistent opposite. He wasn't a consistent threat opposite AJ. So to me, it's not the biggest of deals. It's really just more pressure on the run game, I would say, than anything else. So that's all I got.
Well, yeah, I mean that's it's an interesting take, and unfortunately that position was one of the biggest concerns going into this offseason because of the Bengals lost Sanu and Jones, and now they're losing more guys at the position, which isn't sounding good. Obviously, some stuff has to play out. Scott, another guy that has had an injury. He played pretty well in the preseason opener for the most part. He started at right tackle, Cedric Ogbuehi. He has a toe injury. It sounds like he'll probably be okay, but for the time being, Jake Fisher has slid over to that right tackle spot. Jake Fisher struggled at left tackle in relief of Andrew Whitworth, who was nursing a ding himself. Is there maybe too high of expectations on both of those guys? Is it just we're hitting the panic button too early on both of them? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think with Ogbuehi, I know he kind of struggled, and they were saying in camp he was struggling against Dunlap. Granted, that was Dunlap. I think a lot of people struggle against Dunlap. But and with the injuries, I know they tend to be extra cautious in camp. If you look at the history, teams are really good about, if it was the season, some of these guys might be playing, but since it's camp, they realize the games don't mean a whole lot, so they're just trying to keep them extra cautious. So I'm not too concerned. Well, I shouldn't say I'm not too concerned about his health since he missed all of last year, pretty much. When they were drafted, there was a lot of debate on which one was going to be the future left and the future right. And I think at the time, if I remember, the idea was Jake Fisher would become the right, 3-4 years down the road, and he would be that left tackle to replace Whitworth. And they were talking about how he was very athletic and he was kind of. So if anything, this may ramp that up. If he's out for a little bit, and if Jake's been struggling on the left, and I think when he was in college, he may have been one of the top flagged. Fisher, I think it was like I think he had set a record, not a record, but led the NCAA in holding penalties or something.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing that. Yeah.
So maybe if he's better fit for the right side, it could be that, okay, we just kind of get him over there now. And I think they're probably figuring of the two, oh boy, he's better, get your best people out there. But this could end up working for the best if Jake is going to be the right tackle of the future. Just, get him out there right now, let Cedric get fully healed, and let him sit behind Whitworth, let him learn. And as the season goes, I think they will probably do what they did last year, where they kind of sat Whitworth here and there. They put Winston in, I think, a couple times. And so it'd probably be something like that. They'd probably just slowly ease Abuehi into that left tackle spot. So I think from that perspective, it's not um, a deal breaker. Now, if we lost, a major player like Whitworth or something, I think there'd be more reason to, scream the sky's falling. But either way, it's depth, and it sucks to lose depth. But I think in this case, it could actually work out for them as far as getting them kind of trained up in the positions that they kind of envision them being in, 3, 4 years in the future.
Yeah, good point. So those are the training camp news and notes aside from the preseason opener that occurred last Friday. Unfortunately, we're not going to dwell on the negative, but unfortunately, a lot of the news coming out of camp with the Bengals is having to do with injuries and them kind of putting things together with duct tape and Band-Aids and all kinds of stuff. So keep it posted not only to the Orange and Black Insider, but to Cincy Jungle for the most up-to-date injury news and other news coming out of camp with the Bengals. That being said, we're not going to spend a ton of time on the next upcoming game against the Lions on Thursday night, but I do want to talk about some guys that you both would like to see step up, either play even better than they did in the first game, get more playing time, or if they had a disappointing game in the opener, that you would like to see them really rebound and have a nice night. So, Connor, give me two names that you're looking at that you hope has a good night against the Lions.
Number one, Rashawn Simoniz, my boy.
Of course.
I interviewed him earlier in case people didn't know, but I think one thing he said that really stuck with me is that his goal wasn't, oh, I want to make the practice squad. It was that I want to make the 53-man roster. And I think it's a mentality that most players have at this point. But I think fans are too quick to just say, oh, well, including myself, that oh, he's just going to be, at the best, he's going to be on the practice squad. He's probably not going to be on the team. But just take a step back. I mean, he really couldn't have fallen into a better situation. Last year we had Terrell Watson and James Wilder, who could have probably, like, Terrell Watson's, I think, the number 3 in Cleveland, and he was really, really good last year, but he got buried on a depth chart that really just didn't have room for him. And here's Simoniz, and I can throw in Jake Kumaro as kind of a synonym to Simoniz. One of these two guys has both of these players have the size and the speed and just like the intangibles of a guy who looks like a perimeter receiver in the NFL. And opposite AJ Green right now is a big empty hole, whether we like it or not. Even with Brandon Tate there, we really aren't 100% sure whether or not he's going to be the guy. I think I'm pretty confident that if he plays this year, he's going to be that guy. But if he doesn't, it's there for the taking. So those two guys are kind of my number one together. And my number two, I'll go with Rex Burkhead. I mean, and this isn't necessarily for the Bengals. This is just for him himself. But Burkhead's a guy where we saw, Terrell Watson was great last year, as I mentioned. So was Wilder. And Peterman is a special teams ace. Burkhead led the team in special team snaps last year. So if Burkhead really wants to stick around in Cincinnati, it's going to have to – I think it could be either special teams or a running game or a combination of both. But really the one play that stuck out with him more than any other play that he had last year was his fumble against Seattle, which really, really killed Cincinnati. And so I think that if Burkhead has a solid preseason, whether it helps him play in Cincinnati or for another team long term, but just rooting for the player himself, I think that a big preseason could go a long way for Burkhead. He's a solid special teamer. He has the potential to be a solid running back, potentially even a Giovanni Bernard type running back, either in Cincinnati or somewhere else. And so I hope personally that he plays well and earns his payday, whether in Cincinnati or elsewhere. But those are my two guys, / kind of three guys.
Yeah, I love how you kind of wheedled in that the three guys there, Connor. I love how you did that. Scott, give me two if you can.
Two, I can give you 2.5.
Okay.
The first one I'm going to say, actually, the two guys I'm picking are guys who I've been very high on ever since they joined the team, and just for whatever reason have not really had their big chance. One that Connor kind of alluded to is Jake Kumaro. Just he has the golden opportunity now with everyone kind of falling in front of him. They lost, Jones and Sanu in free agency. The guys they're bringing in, LaFell got hurt. You're talking about Core and Alfred. And, if he's going to do it, this is really his chance. He got hurt early in camp, didn't get to play a whole lot in week one. I'd really like to see him do something and kind of earn that spot. I think one of our previous podcasts, I made a bold prediction about him. So it'd be very nice to see if he can live up to that and not have another one of these bold predictions kind of
You
fall
want
flat.
to pat yourself on the back. I got you. Yeah, I
Just
got
a
you.
little bit.
That's what we're all in it for. I mean, at the end of the day.
That's right.
The second one I want to say is a similar guy, PJ Dawson, someone who I've been very high on ever since we entered the draft cycle, a year and a half ago. Just the whole idea how he kind of came from junior college as a wide receiver, kind of came out of nowhere, moved to linebacker, had only been in the position for a couple years, went to TCU, just after his first year just kind of dominated the position, just amazing game tape. He seems very instinctive, knows what to do, but the knock on him was he wasn't the fastest guy and doesn't look the part when he practices. And that was kind of the knock last year. The Bengals didn't want to put him in because he was a rookie, and I guess there were some issues with practice and assignment. But when they put him in, it seemed like he did really well. I remember some big stops, some big plays he had, and he got to play last week. And I really want to see him get a chance because if he's one of these guys that shows up on Sunday but not so much in practice, this is where he needs to shine. And so I'm really looking forward to see can he get in the game and can he do some of that exciting stuff that we saw at TCU and in those glimmers last year that make the Bengals coaches say, hey, maybe this guy does need to get more playing time. So those are my two. The half I want to add is, if I remember correctly, and I was a little kid when this happened, when the Bengals traded up and drafted Kajana Carter, and he got hurt on like that first run of the first preseason game, I think it was the Lions. So I just want no injuries. I may need to look it up and confirm it was the Lions, but I'm pretty sure it was the Detroit Lions. The very first play where he just ran, got stuffed to the line, and that was his career. So that's the guy who I want to see beyond anything else is the no injury guy.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, and it happened, if you remember, a few years later, it happened to Kenny Irons against the Lions on their turf too, and he never played another down for any team going forward. So good stuff, Scott, and I agree with you on the Dawson thing. And if you know Marvin Lewis, if you've been a fan of this team for a long time, you know Marvin Lewis likes guys who practice a certain way, prepare a certain way. And if you remember back to Carlos Dunlap's rookie year in 2010, there was through the first portion of the season, he was really in Marvin Lewis's doghouse because he wasn't putting forth the effort they thought he should in practice. That was the word out of camp, and all of a sudden they finally said, you know what, 2010 was kind of a lost season, so they said, well, let's start playing some of these talented rookies, and he ended up having a pretty good rookie campaign and obviously a pretty good career since then. So sometimes the Bengals coaches and Marvin Lewis need to get out of their own way. My two guys, and it revolves around one position, and those who have read my stuff on Cincy Jungle or heard my rantings and ravings through various things know that I've been pretty obsessed and weirdly obsessed with the tight end position this year. And I think my point was that it had to do with a potential issue with injuries. Tyler Eifert is often injured, though incredibly talented. There's some inexperience behind him. So I just had this weird thought, and I think it was one of our earlier episodes I talked about where I was right, and it was about the tight end position. But I'm really looking to see CJ Uzama to step up this game, and he had a pass attempt. It would have been a difficult catch, but I thought it was catchable. He dropped. It would have been like a nice 15 to 20 yarder in the opener. I hope he steps up and really plays well in this next game to kind of give confidence to the team in that position, especially if they're going to be losing Tyler Kroft for any more significant time. If Eifert's rehab kind of goes by the wayside and he loses more time. The other guy kind of interrelated to that because Ryan Hewitt, who is the starting H-back for the team and fullback, has now had to move to kind of a backup tight end duty. They've now put Jeff Luke, who was a University of Cincinnati linebacker, they've put him at fullback, and I actually saw him have a couple of nice blocks in the opener there. I'd like to see him continue that momentum. If everything plays out positively in terms of the injury front for the Bengals, I don't think Luke makes it. I think they move Hewitt back there and make their make their switches there. But I would like to see if there is a hiccup in any of those injuries at the tight end position. I would like to see Luke step up and continue to spark the run game that we saw early on in the preseason opener. So those are some of the guys we're looking at in preseason week 2 against the Lions. It's time now for a weekly segment. Scott, you got the floor. It's the Fantasy Football Insider. So far, you've given us some great insight on running backs and quarterbacks. You've got a little bit of the unsung heroes in fantasy football this week, I think. So give us some inside information, because these drafts are now really starting to ramp up through the month of August.
Yeah, like you said, we covered the quarterbacks and the running backs. So obviously, the next logical position is defense and kickers. The thing everyone loves to draft when it comes to fantasy. And one very interesting thing is, if you look at fantasy over the past 7, 8, 9 years, the difference between your best defense and your 12th defense, and you figure there's 12 teams in the league, so 12th defense is kind of like your replacement level, is average about 40 points. It's sometimes as high as like 50 or 60 points. So there's a pretty big drop. That's kind of like the drop from Gronkowski next to like the third or fourth tight end. And a lot of people draft Gronkowski, first round, early second, because of that huge drop. So there's a big drop in defense, and that top 1 or 2 defenses can really carry your team. And so every year, if you've been in fantasy football drafts long enough, you'll always see that there's 1 or 2 owners who, come around 7 or 8, they draft that defense from last year. Someone's going to do it this year with Denver. Someone did it last year in your league, probably with Seattle. The year before, someone's always drafting that team because there is that big difference. And so the question is that really worth it? Since there is such a big drop from that top defense down to what you're going to get if you kind of wait till last round, is it worth, when everyone kind of laughs and everyone's like, oh my gosh, you drafted them early? Short answer is no. Long answer is no. There's just no reason to be drafting a defense before the very end of your draft. And the reasons for that are, if you look at the year to year change. So you look at everyone's always chasing last year's points, and I think that was something I mentioned with the quarterbacks last week. That's so you look at from 2008, 2009, from 9 to 10, so on. You look at from last year to this year, and this year, what's projected in 2016. One interesting statistic is only 41% of last year's top 10 defenses will finish this year in the top 10. And on average, the team that finished first as the defense, so Denver last year, Seattle the year before, those number 1 top, the ones that the guy's always drafting, in the middle, that one guy's taking them in around 6, 7, 8, their average finish the next year is the 10th best defense. And even if they're a good actual defense in the NFL, they always fall. And the number 2 defense, so I think last year was Arizona or Carolina, so someone's going to be drafting them high. Their average finish the next year is 12th. And so why are these teams dropping, or these defenses dropping so much? And it's because defenses are carried by defensive touchdowns. The pick sixes, the punt return, the kick returns. And for a while, teams were, your savvy owners were like, oh, I'm drafting Chicago because they have Devin Hester. I'm drafting the Browns because they have Josh Cribbs, and I'm going to get that, defensive touchdown. And you just can't predict those. I mean, if you look back at history, a team will get, I think Kansas City is a great example. They went from like the 18th defense to number 1 or 2, and the next year went to like number 30th because they just had a lot of fumble returns for touchdowns that year. And the next year, everyone reached for them really high, and you just can't repeat it. And so as far as defenses, that's kind of the big things I just wanted to point out is when it comes, if you're kind of tempted, just don't be that guy. Don't be that guy that's like, I'm going to outthink the rest of the league. I'm going to grab, Denver, Carolina. And granted, there's the chance they might have a repeat year. The odds are horribly low. The odds are much more likely they're not even going to be a top 10. And you look at those teams, I think Arizona had a lot of returns for touchdowns. Denver lost Peyton Manning, so they're probably going to struggle, be giving up a lot more points. And so the best thing to do is just kind of, look for a solid defense, a team that seems to not give up a lot of points, maybe has some good sacks, and just, see who's there in the last round, second last round. But yeah, just don't be crazy when it comes to defenses.
And look for teams.
Kickers. Sorry.
Go for it.
And the other thing I also mentioned was the kickers. The other one that people like to talk about. The whole idea kickers are people too. And in fantasy, yeah, they kind of are. They're a necessity. You have to have them, even if it's Nugent. You have to have your kicker. Um, and kind of the same thing with defenses. The difference between the top kicker and that 11th, 12th kicker, the one that kind of replacement one, if you kind of wait and just stream kickers during the year, there is a drop. It's averages like 30 points a year between the best one and the others. So like Goskowski or years ago it was Vinatieri, and there's always that top kicker, and someone's always going to reach for that kicker. Usually a round or two before everyone else. And one interesting thing I looked up, I was kind of curious. Well, how do you determine who a good kicker is for fantasy? How do you project? And a very interesting statistic that I came up with. So I'm going to patent this or coin it or I don't know, whatever. Trademark it. Is that on average, um, kickers score about 1.7 points per kick attempt. So that's extra point attempts and field goal attempts. I don't know why that is. That just historically over the last 7 to 9 years, that's just what it seems to be. So with that in mind, you want a guy who's going to make a lot of attempts kicking the ball. Field goals are very fluky. You had someone like I think it was what Cairo for Kansas City last year had like 5 or 6 field goals in a game. I think Rob Baronis one year had 6 or 7 field goals in a game. You you just have no way of knowing that stuff's going to happen unless you have a direct line to like the patron saint of fantasy football. You're really not going to be able to project that. So you just need to um, realize you're not going to be able to. It's like day trading. I mean, some people can do it. I think a lot of us probably can't. So the big thing with the kickers is look for a team that's going to move the ball because the more they can move the ball offensively, the more yards they get. And there actually is some sort of correlation there without putting all the statistics on the podcast. The more a team is able to move the ball in yardage wise, the more kick attempts they get, and the more kick attempts they get, the more times that 1.7 points per kick attempt, the more points they get. You can look at field goal accuracy. That plays a little bit. It doesn't really seem to affect it a whole lot because if you're a bad kicker, you're just going to get cut, so you're not going to get points anyway. So the big thing with kickers is just look at a team that seems to move the ball. And so everyone usually does that. They take the high scoring guys like Goskowski because New England moves the ball. They have a good offense. When Peyton Manning was with the Colts, the Colts kicker was always a big one. When Peyton Manning was with the Broncos, the Denver's kicker was. So just kind of keep in mind who are the offenses you think are going to be good at moving the ball this year, and target their kicker. There's no reason not to wait for a last round. There's not going to be a whole lot of difference. You're really not going to know. No one really expected Carolina to move the ball as well as they did. Their kicker, Gano, was really good last year. The kicker for Arizona was really good because their offense was on fire. So yeah, just kind of wait, kind of chill out, wait till last round, see which good offense's kicker is still there, and then yeah, scoop him. So that'd be my advice. Hopefully it works, and if it doesn't, then
I'm with you, Scott, but man, you got to take Gostkowski early, man. Last year I took him in like round 7, and you don't realize how great a kicker is, like having one of the top 5 kickers until you actually see, oh my gosh, he's getting me 12 points every week or whatever it happens to be. And if you
yeah.
and if you don't draft Gostkowski high, don't draft anyone high because, like you said, they're all going to be there at the end of the draft. And very good chance there's going to be a top 5 kicker available on waivers within the first 4 weeks. And the same can be said with defense. And one thing I just want to say really quick is Cincinnati, I think, has had 20 plus picks in each of the past 3 years. Whether it's Cincinnati or another team that you trust, take a team that has put up consistent statistics. Whether it's like Scott said, I think pick sixes play a big part in a team having a good year as a defense special teams, but I think a team also that puts up consistent numbers, whether in sacks or picks or forced fumbles, whatever it is, those are pretty good teams to target. But yeah, like Scott said, don't draft either one too high unless you're taking Gostkowski, in my opinion.
Well, and that's the interesting thing. You mentioned being able to get a kicker late. You look at some of the teams who a lot of people are saying these are going to be good offenses. Dallas, now that Romo's back, they got Zeke Elliott from Ohio State. Des Bryant's healthy. A lot of people were touting them. But you look at their kicker. He's going like 10th, 11th, 12th kicker taken. Pittsburgh. Okay, we all hate Pittsburgh for obvious reasons, but you look at their offense, everyone's saying, oh, they're going to have this wonderful offense. Chris Boswell isn't going in the top 5 or 6. And so you can get good values. You can really get those kickers who, you know, if you sit and wait, just don't do anything stupid. You're not going to grab Washington's kicker. You're not going to grab the Rams kick. There's certain things you're just not going to do. But now, if you're in one of these leagues where people draft backup kickers for some strange reason, then okay, throw everything I said out the
Then
window.
play in a new league. That's what you need to do.
Exactly.
And also, just a quick story today, humble brag, but I was at Chargers practice, and I was operating this tent, and before we were at the tent, there were players from the Cardinals there. And I saw this cleat on the ground that looks like a kid's cleat, and I was trying to figure out whose cleats are these. And then, what do you know, I see Chandler Catanzaro walking around looking for something, happens to be the Cardinals kicker, and we were like, what are you looking for, Chandler? He's like, oh, I left shoes over here somewhere. It legitimately looks like kids' shoes. I mean, those kickers is crazy. They step their foot into a shoe that's like probably a size 5. It's crazy.
All right. Well, good stuff, Scott. That is the Fantasy Football Insider, courtesy of the Orange and Black Insider podcast. If you are taking Scott's advice, we would love to hear some feedback in how your draft goes and how your season goes based on his advice, and it is sage advice. To your guys' point, the Bengals defense and special teams has been a pretty solid get, and you can get them late in a lot of drafts. I've noticed that, and it is a bit of a roll of the dice with some of those units. But Scott, good stuff as always this week, and that is the Fantasy Football Insider segment of the Orange and Black Insider podcast. Another segment we've been doing of late, and it's been kind of fun because we get to put some people on blast, and there are a number of critics of the Bengals. They're never short of those. So we've been doing a hater of the week, and we keep seeming to find them this off season. So we're going to keep doing it as long as they keep coming. And this one might be a little weaker than some of the others. We've had Colin Cowherd of Fox Sports. We've had Frank Schwab of Yahoo Sports. We've had Dave Damashek of NFL Network. Connor, you found this one, so I'm going to let you talk about it just for a minute here. Mike Sando of ESPN did some quarterback rankings. I believe he does these every year, if I'm not mistaken. And so he had some interesting takes on Andy Dalton, even after an MVP-like year.
Yeah, I have to say I had to do some digging at work today to try to think about who's a hater I could come up with, and then I realized I've been listening to a couple of podcasts this week that were talking about this ESPN QB tier rankings, and Mike Sando of ESPN, or Sando, whatever it is. I'm going with Sando.
Sando's classier for sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of a pinky up name, but so you have Sando of ESPN, and he's talking about QB tier rankings, and his tier 1 quarterback is kind of a guy where it's like, okay, this is your quarterback. You don't need anyone around him. He's going to help you make it to the Super Bowl. I think that's kind of the premise. And those 3 guys he had there were Brady, Aaron Rodgers, and Ben Roethlisberger, which was kind of interesting that he had Roethlisberger up there. But that's a point for another day. The point that I'm making is that he listed Dalton as a tier 2 quarterback, which is great because I think Dalton is. Which is, I think, by his definition, kind of a quarterback who is a really good player but needs some guys around him to succeed. And he listed pretty much anyone who you would imagine as a top 15 quarterback. I think Dalton was number 18 on the list. So there were a couple guys ahead of him that I really had beef with. I really didn't like the fact that he had Dalton behind Matthew Stafford, Joe Flacco, and Eli Manning, and then he was behind Matt Ryan too as well, which I think the biggest beef I have with any of these quarterbacks is Eli Manning. I mean, Manning, we're talking right now in 2016 about a potential Eli Manning Hall of Fame nod. And Manning, when in his entire career has Eli Manning been a top 10 quarterback? Granted, he's won a couple Super Bowl rings, but it's absolutely mind-boggling to me that Eli Manning is anywhere near Andy Dalton on the court. I think if I was going to compare Eli Manning to any quarterback in terms of ability level, I would compare him to Tannehill. I think he's just one of those guys where you really don't know what you have with him. Manning, even in his playoffs, really benefited from some great plays from his receivers. I think that his one play, the helmet catch play when he broke away, spun away from the tackle, was just a work of art, and there's really nothing you can do to negate him of that. But just the whole Eli Manning thing, and having a guy like Stafford or Flacco has been completely off the radar for the past 5 years. I don't think he's made a Pro Bowl in his entire career. So just these guys ahead of Dalton. Sando, watch some more tape, man.
You had mentioned Ben Roethlisberger in that first tier and Dalton in that second tier down to 18, which seems to be kind of the popular spot for him. One interesting statistic I think a lot of people don't realize is if you compare Ben's first 5 years and Dalton's first 5 years, it's amazing who the better quarterback is. They both played 70 some games. I think Dalton played 77 and Ben played 73. About the same number of games. Their completion percentages were about the same, 62.5%. Yards per game, Ben was at 206, Dalton's at 234. So definitely throwing the ball a lot more, being dependent on a lot more to carry the team, win the game. Touchdowns. Dalton has 23 more passing touchdowns and 4 more rushing. So 27 more total touchdowns. Then their touchdown percentages were about the same, about 5%. And amazingly, Dalton actually has a lower interception percentage at 2.9. I think Roethlisberger was 3.6. So, but because he won games, even though he really wasn't counted on to carry the team for the first few years, it was more defense and running, and hey, just hand the ball off, throw when you have to Santonio Holmes or whoever.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people just overlook, kind of you said with Eli Manning, they look at the team won and they kind of put him up there in that elite tier without really realizing it. That over the start of their career, Dalton's actually been a better quarterback than Ben Roethlisberger was, and you probably won't hear anyone say that.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the picks last year and say, oh, Roethlisberger was worse than Dalton. I think that's kind of an overreaction. Roethlisberger's a great player. I don't really think there's any taking away from that. And I do agree. I think it's definitely worth making the argument that Dalton could have been as good or better than Roethlisberger in his first 5 years. But at the end of the day, Roethlisberger is still a great quarterback. I don't know if he deserves to be in tier one. But this list was also, I think we didn't mention this, but it was Sando, whatever, worked on it, but as well as I think what helped to make the list was I think he had several, if not 30 or more so, NFL front office people, whether it be, I should say execs, whether it be front office or general managers, coaches, whatever it is. And so I just think it's more, not necessarily at Sando, but just a shot at just the NFL for just overvaluing past. I think it's so crazy that like we were talking about earlier in fantasy, that in fantasy I feel like coaches are much more, or I should say fantasy coaches are much more interested in what happened last year, whereas I think in the NFL coaches don't necessarily take it year by year, perhaps maybe into a fault, because sure, Dalton had I think people want to attribute last year to like a bunch of inflated numbers and maybe it's just kind of an anomaly to his career. But really, what was more impressive than his numbers was his playing. He was one of the best in terms of changing the play call at the line of scrimmage and recognizing defenses. He's elite at that, and it's not really a homerism to say that. He really is. He's one of the best. He reminds me of Peyton Manning when Peyton Manning used to do that. I remember playing Madden against Peyton Manning was the most annoying thing ever, because the computer would always make it so that Peyton Manning would call 80 audibles before the play, and I just wanted the game to end so I could go back to doing whatever I was doing beforehand. But Dalton's one of those guys where he's really changed the play at the line of scrimmage a lot, and I think he's really improved at that. And his footwork has gotten a lot better. He's been able to read defenses, has gotten a lot less reliant on AJ Green, not necessarily because he has better receivers, but just because he's not forcing the ball anymore. And then overall else, which has been the most impressive to me, I think, is the fact that he's somehow improved his arm strength, which is phenomenal. He's a great quarterback. I think that's all that really needs to be said.
Well, you mentioned Dalton. I think that was one of the reasons they drafted him, was that ability to know the offense. There's that famous story of when Jay Gruden gave him the playbook that he contacted the team. I think they gave all the top picks, Newton, Ponder, Kaepernick, Dalton, they gave them all a playbook and said, hey, look over this, and then we'll bring you in and we'll ask you questions about it. And I think Dalton was the one that said, hey, I found an error. This doesn't make any sense. And there was actually an error, an unintended error in the playbook. So, yeah, from day one, he's always kind of been that guy who has the ability to kind of understand what the concepts are, what the team's trying to do, read the defense, and know what to do with it. So, I think he's definitely growing in that regard.
Yeah, and last year was a great year for Andy Dalton, obviously, but some of those people that are ranked ahead of him, you guys know it as well as I do. small market Cincinnati, lack of postseason success. That's what it comes down to, and that's why Eli Manning's ahead of him. If you actually saw Eli Manning's numbers last year, he did have a very high quality season last year. Statistically, the team wasn't that great, but he played pretty well, and that's why they hired the new head coach that they did. But it's small market and postseason lack of success is what's going to continue to knock Andy Dalton until that changes. You're going to see him in that 18 to 20 range, ranked in quarterbacks that we continually see him.
Totally agree.
Yep. So we're gonna close up here. The final segment is going to be some fan questions, and the questions that I'm going to give out to you guys have actually come. I did a Facebook Live session for Cincy Jungle earlier this week, and in those sessions, I think, Connor, you've done a couple. You know as well as I do that you can't get to every single question that comes your way on there, but there are a number of good ones that happen to get glossed over. So part of what we do with this podcast is to make sure that we get some of those high-quality questions answered from some of our fans. So, Scott, I'm gonna start with you. You actually had heard a recent interview with, I believe it was Dave Lapham on this topic, but it's from Sam Anger, and it's talking about a scenario. Can you see Westerman, who is the rookie guard / backup center, being a starter at some point in the season? I'm just not sure I'm excited on the thought of Bodie starting at center, and I don't know if Westerman has had experience at the position. Your thoughts on that? Maybe touch on a little bit of what Lapham said that you heard on the radio.
Yeah, I think this is a question probably a lot of fans have been asking ever since Bodine was drafted and kind of anointed the starter spot kind of from day one. He really didn't look it in college. He didn't look it in camp. Every year he's been here, he's kind of been the weak link. I know Pro Football Focus tends to hate him. They usually rate him as the worst Bengal in the history of, Bengaldom, or at least current Bengals. And yeah, he's just there's been a lot of issues with Dalton being able to step up in the pocket, getting the run game in the middle. So I think this is a very common question that dates back probably several years. I know when Hopkins was having that big year at guard, a lot of people were saying, hey, maybe he can play center. When we had Bowling and Zeitler doing well, the thought was, hey, maybe we can move a tackle to one of their spots, move them to center. And then, of course, when Westerman was drafted, I think a lot of Bengals fans were kind of secretly or not secretly hoping, hey, hopefully this is the guy who's going to push Bodine. So I think it's something a lot of fans would like to see happen. I think the short answer is it's just not going to happen. Paul Alexander has been very vehement in defending Bodine, that he is his man. He's stuck behind him. Every interview he's done has always been he's getting better, he's doing what we want him to do. I don't know how getting pushed backwards what you want him to do, but that's what he's doing, what they want him to do. And then he mentioned today in the interview, there was an interview and they were talking to Paul Alexander briefly about the offensive line, about some of the players, and he did mention Westerman. I think he mentioned Hopkins also. And when he mentioned them at the two guard spots. He never mentioned either one at center, about backup center, playing center, which is kind of disappointing. You kind of hope at least you'd hear him say, yeah, we're giving him a shot. And even at that that second center spot, it seems to be they're not really giving Westerman a shot at that. For whatever reason, he seems to have the bench press strength that I know Paul Alexander seems to like, but he just doesn't seem to be as much as I think fans would like to see it. Unless Bodine gets hurt or just does something horrible this year. As much as we'd like to see it, I just would be very surprised to see them say, yeah, we screwed up on the guy we traded up for. It's just not working out. We're going to try another option.
Yeah, one of the unfortunate traits of the Bengals coaching staff, Marvin Lewis and company, they get stuck on certain players, and they can be very stubborn in sticking with those players, even through thick and thin. I mean, Nate Livings was another guy that you saw that had trouble at guard. There's been a myriad of centers. Kyle Cook had I think he's been the best of a recent group, but he had his ups and downs. There's Eric Guychek, Stacey Andrews. I mean, and unfortunately, a lot of them are on the offensive line, but they just really seem to stick to their guns on certain players. And right or wrong, I mean, they keep throwing them out there. Bodine, this year 3 is kind of a big growth year for a lot of players. I think it was Connor that mentioned earlier he saw some good things out of him in the preseason opener. I did too, but I also saw one errant snap and some other issues kind of keep popping up again. But yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a shame that they're not even really giving Christian Westerman, much of a look at center to even compete with Bodine there. So, but good stuff, Scott. So thank you to Sam Anger there on that question. The next one is for you, Connor. It's from Andrew Fritsch. Will the Bengals sign a free agent wide receiver if LaFell is out? And I'm assuming it was a kind of a brief comment. I'm assuming if he meant if LaFell is out for an extended period of time, which may or may not be the case going into this season.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I honestly don't really know if I can even answer that question directly. But if you look at the free agent market, there's a reason why Cincinnati hasn't signed a free agent receiver. Obviously, fans were really high on Anquan Bolden, and Cincinnati, for whatever reason, never really made an attempt to sign him. I think it's worth noting he's been kind of over the hill. He was mentioned as an old guy when he was on the Ravens, helping them win the Super Bowl in 2012, and he's had some playoff success. And so maybe that's why fans like him, but he's looked really slow. He's looked his age in the past couple of years. And so when you look at the names who are available, Roddy White, Brian Hartline, Lance Moore, I mean, really anyone. There's a reason why most teams right now are signing guys who are no-namers, hoping that they can potentially become someone, because all of the established quote-unquote guys who are in the league, Lance Moore, Hartline, Roddy White, I think it's insane that fans think that these guys can be a potential option. I mean, Roddy White hasn't been relevant for several years, and with good reason, he hasn't been good. So I think there's a couple of guys that we could potentially target, but I think those are more so going to be cut guys. One name I really had my eye on was Kendall Wright in Tennessee. He kind of looked like he was on the bubble, but they just traded away Dorial Green-Beckham, so I think he's safe. But I'm just going to continue to look at those guys who are maybe not make the team because of a high salary or for whatever reason. Those guys are probably the guys that Cincinnati would target if, like I said, LaFell chooses to opt for that surgery.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I'm going to dispute you on there, Connor, is you talked about the team, or fans clamoring for certain big name wide receivers like a Roddy White and stuff. You have to remember, at times, this just a couple of years ago, the team trotted out Greg Little with a myriad of injuries when there were other bigger names out there, and Greg Little, he made some plays, but he still had the questionable hands, obviously. Yeah. So I agree with you. I would like to see them get a more established guy, but to your point, I think the free agent market is pretty thin, and I think, if you've seen the Bengals, how they operate at this time of year, the last couple of years they've been a little quiet in terms of final roster cuts and everything, but they do scour the waiver wire for waiver cuts and all of those things, and then they also have swung some trades late in the offseason too. So it's definitely a position to keep an eye on, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'd love an established guy. Like I said, I think it's going to be a waivers guy, maybe a Cordell Patterson, which I think there's no chance he hits waivers. But if for whatever miracle reason he hit waivers, he'd be a guy. Maybe one of those Redskins guys, Deshaun Jackson or Pierre Garçon. Like I said, I think there's a 0% chance any of those three guys hits. Yeah, I don't think they're gonna cut him. But basically, my whole point is the best guy who's been available this free agency period has been James Jones, and even after San Diego signed him, he looks like he's probably going to be the number 4 on their depth chart. There's really not a guy who I'm very encouraged by who's on the free agent market. And maybe for whatever reason, some team cuts a guy who miraculously makes a difference for Cincinnati. But last year we saw a guy like Denarius Moore come in. I think there's going to be one of those guys who maybe had a decent year a few years ago, still kind of young, potentially able to make an impact, but not a huge name like a Roddy White or a whatever it is. Maybe Hakeem Nicks might actually be the best guy on the free agent market right now, and he just got cut. So every team has to cut someone for a reason.
It's going to sound strange, but one name which kind of goes in their MO would be Justin Blackmon. I don't know if he's still suspended for another year or two, but the whole idea, the guys like Adam Jones, the guys they reclaimed, I mean, he was a top 10 talent.
Yep.
And if he wants a chance, it'd be as long as he's not suspended.
I would love it. I think I also need to shut down the rumor. Well, I don't know if it's a rumor, but I think some people are thinking, oh, well, what if the Bengals could trade for Josh Gordon? Yeah, that's not going to happen. It's a division rival. They don't want a guy who's had a career year to ever touch Cincinnati. So, yeah, for those who think that Josh Gordon is a remote possibility, unless they cut him, which they won't, he's not unless he fails on the drug test, and then maybe they cut him, and then he's not worth having because he's out for the next X amount of years. But he's not a guy that is ever going to make his way to Cincinnati unless he's a free agent at some point.
Ocho Cinco.
Yeah, there you go.
Call him up, man. Call him up.
Yeah, it's funny, Connor. Some of those names, those veteran names you threw out there, it is eerily similar to the profile of Brandon LaFell. I mean, it's really funny, and it would probably be on a prove it type of deal that Brandon LaFell is on. So it's just that position is so in flux right now. There's so many injuries, and some of them severe, some of them not. So we've just got to let some things play out. But the good news, as we mentioned early in the show, a lot of those back-end roster guys showed some promise in that preseason opener. They were making catches, big plays. So, they may stick with who they have, but do not be surprised just because of the injuries if the Bengals make a player trade, claim someone off of waivers, that sort of thing, as final cuts loom.
Maybe Jeff Janis. He might get cut. I don't know.
Yeah.
Possibility.
Yep. So that is the fan question segment that we've been doing for the most part on this podcast. Appreciate the questions from both Sam Anger and Andrew Fritsch. Keep those questions coming at Bengals OBI on Twitter, the obinsider@gmail.com. You can leave questions in the comment section of the post where this podcast will be on Cincy Jungle. So we want the feedback, we want your questions, and we want to give you the best answers possible because we're pretty smart guys and we pride ourselves on our Bengals knowledge. So
humble brag.
Yep, humble brag. Another pat on the back. One little personal announcement I want to make to not only the listeners but primarily Scott as well. I actually have, it's been a birthday gift. I have actually been given tickets to the Bengals season opener against the Broncos in Cincinnati. So I will actually be in Cincinnati for that weekend. I believe the game is on the 25th if I remember correctly. So I'll be in Cincinnati over that weekend, and I would love to meet our readers, our listeners, fellow Cincy Jungle staff, everybody. And I will be in attendance in that game. I'll be with my wife, my brother, and his wife as well, and pretty excited about that. I haven't been to Cincinnati probably in about 10 years, so looking forward to seeing some of the familiar sights, some new changes in the city. But please, not only hit up the Orange and Black Insider social media and email accounts, but also hit me up at CJAnthonyCUY on Twitter. And maybe we can meet up, have a drink, and talk some Bengals. I would love to meet some of these people that I've been interacting with for so long in person. So if you're going to the game, if you're going to be in the Cincinnati area that weekend, I'd love to meet up with you and have a chat, have a beer, and talk some Bengals with you.
I envy you. That's all I'm going to say.
Scott, if you're around, I know you're a little bit out of Cincinnati, but would love to meet up with you, bud.
Yeah.
All right, well, episode 4 in the can, the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast presented by Cincy Jungle. We went through a lot of stuff tonight. We hope you enjoy what we're doing. We hope please leave ratings on the iTunes and give us some feedback on how we're doing. Please get in touch with us. I've given the information out a number of times. Be in touch with us. We want this to be an interactive show with our listeners and the readers at Cincy Jungle. So please, please, please be in touch with us. And we're looking forward to preseason week 2 Thursday night against the Lions. And for Connor Howe, Scott Schulte, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Let's have a good season. Let's stop the injuries, okay? Can we stop having these injuries, please?
Please.
And I know, seriously. And let's have a good preseason week 2, guys. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And for the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast presented by Cincy Jungle, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Hoo day.
Hoo day.
Hoo day.